my fellow citizens, more than mine, will rest the final success or failure of our course.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy foi o 35º presidente dos Estados Unidos. Era o jovem e bem parecido líder que prometeu uma nova esperança.
The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century.
Um político moderno para uma América moderna.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Contudo, a vida de JFK é muitas vezes definida pela sua morte. O seu assassinato, em novembro de 1963, acabou por ser visto como um ponto de viragem para os Estados Unidos, a passagem de uma idade de inocência para uma idade de violência e mudança. O próprio JFK passou de homem a lenda.
This young, handsome, intelligent, terrifically photogenic, but honest political leader was a breath of fresh air on the political scene.
I can't think of any other leader in a Western democratic context who develops such a fantastic image.
For a college boy to give his brand label, to invent a new way of being a politician and a new kind of marketed politics, this was revolutionary.
Esta interpretação da história pode disfarçar o homem fascinante e contraditório por trás do mito.
Jack Kennedy never performed very well at school. He was clearly gifted, but he really scraped by in his final grades.
He was the walking textbook of illnesses. It's astonishing he survived childhood.
People sometimes assume that it was almost accidental that JFK happened to have been in Berlin in 1939, a few days before the declaration of war, that he'd been to Palestine, that he'd been to Indochina. But it's clear from the diaries he kept that was what excited him about the study of politics.
There's this quality of hope and admiration and optimism that he projected that really inspired people, and something about his personality that continues to interest and engage people.
JFK era reconhecido por milhões, mas conhecido por poucos. Este programa vai explicar como se faz um presidente. Nascido em Massachusetts a 29 de maio de 1917, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, familiarmente conhecido como Jack, foi o segundo filho do investidor e político multimilionário Joe Kennedy.
Jack Kennedy was born into a Boston Irish family. It was a middle-class family without any particular political pretensions. The father working in banking, and a mother who actually came from a political family, a Democratic family. Her father had been the mayor of Boston.
Rose Kennedy's father, John Honey Fitzgerald, was a real force in Massachusetts politics. He was elected to Congress 3 times. He was elected mayor of Boston. And Edward Kennedy would say in later years, one of the reasons the Kennedys were always so strong in Massachusetts politically was because of Honey Fitzgerald, the maternal grandfather.
They had a grand home in Hyannisport on Cape Cod. They had a home in Palm Beach, Florida. It was a life of prep schools, of luxury, of tennis courts, of really living in a kind of bubble, very, very far removed from the mass of the American people. It was kind of like being a European aristocrat, which is essentially what he was.
Tendo frequentado várias escolas do ensino básico, o ensino secundário de Jack Kennedy começou formalmente numa escola católica, mas depressa se percebeu que ele era infeliz. Decidiu-se que seria transferido para seguir o irmão em Choate Rosemary Hall, um colégio privado no Connecticut. Embora se pense que foi este colégio a inspirar o famoso discurso de "não perguntem o que pode o vosso país fazer por vocês", Jack não foi mais feliz aqui do que na escola anterior. Mas uma coisa que Choate tinha era o seu irmão, Joe Kennedy Jr. Mas onde o irmão aparentemente brilhava, Jack não conseguia.
His older brother is already there at Choate, and he's kind of the golden boy. He's doing fantastically well, he's on all the sports teams, he's a very diligent student. Jack Kennedy isn't really a diligent student at this point. He's a little bit badly behaved.
He was clearly very smart and very lazy. And not only lazy, he didn't seem to want to excel.
He was bright, he was charming, he had some interest in history and in biography, and he did read, but he was a rather indolent student. And at his prep school, he ended up graduating 65th out of 110. So that's about midway, in fact, below halfway in the class. If you look at his academic record, for example, it's far less impressive than, say, Richard Nixon's.
He chafes at the discipline of the Choate School, and he organizes a club among his friends called the Muckers Club, sort of essentially designed to break school rules.
He was, in fact, expelled to begin with, but his father pleaded he should be kept at school. But he was required to sit down with a psychologist. And the psychologist said, "Jack, you seem to do very well in your classes, but you don't try very hard. You know, what is going on?" And he came up with a brilliant answer. And he said, "Well, my brother does very well. Why should I be doing the same? He does it all for me."
A infância de Jack foi afortunada em muitos sentidos, mas foi amofinado por doenças. Longas temporadas passadas na cama e prolongados períodos de medicação forte começaram durante a infância. Isto delinearia o resto da sua vida.
As a young child, he'd had a very bad case of scarlet fever, and there was a huge outbreak in Boston at the time. His father and his grandfather, Honey Fitz, had to pull strings to get him into the best hospital in Boston.
He was continually ill, either in the school sanatorium or in hospital. And worse still was the fact that very rarely were they able to diagnose what was wrong with him.
It meant that he had long periods off school. There was not only the scarlet fever, there was the pneumonia, there was the asthma.
He had major spinal problems. He was born with one leg slightly shorter than the other. And this created a long-term problem with his back. And it never leaves him, that problem. It's always there.
I think what's remarkable is that he wanted to enjoy the health that others had. He developed a jokey sort of heroism, if you like, that he was coping with what for normal people would be considered life-threatening diseases, but just wouldn't take them seriously.
It's interesting to speculate on the impact of his very severe health problems on his mentality. And I think what it left him with was a live-for-the-moment mentality. I think there was part of Kennedy that thought, I'm not going to be around for long, so I may as well enjoy myself as much as I can, while I can.
Havia profundezas subvalorizadas no Kennedy mais novo que muitos ignoravam. Ele usava as suas doenças frequentes para ler, desenvolvendo a mente e imaginação com as obras de Robert Louis Stevenson, Winston Churchill e outros. Ainda que nos estudos fosse mediano, a sua autodidática era inestimável. À medida que Jack e o irmão cresciam, o pai alimentava a rivalidade entre eles, o que era evidentemente prazer para o empresário Joe Sr.
The Kennedys had to excel at everything. They had to excel at sport, at academia, in debating, in writing, in literature. This family, in other words, were being turned into a brand, groomed for success.
The father had such high expectations of them, and he put them under so much pressure, but also there was a certain degree of sexual competition going on. Both of the two older boys were extremely handsome. They brought home lots of girlfriends, and the father openly not only flirted with the girlfriends, but propositioned them.
It wasn't just that he was a philanderer of spectacular proportions, but that he was completely open about it. His sons knew about it, and the advice which he apparently gave his sons was you need to get laid as often as possible. But also with his affairs, he was open about it, they knew about it, and so obviously that's something he passed on to the sons, including John Kennedy.
The good side is that Joe Kennedy took an acute interest in all his children. In that sense, he was a good father, because remember, in that generation among the elite, both American and British, fathers would often neglect their children. They'd maroon them in boarding schools for years. They'd take no interest in them. Whereas, of course, Joe Kennedy took an aggressive interest in the lives of his children.
Jack viria a terminar os estudos em Choate e, ainda que as suas notas não fossem nada de especial, conseguiu entrar em Harvard. Mas seria nesse verão que começaria a verdadeira educação de Jack Kennedy. Na altura em que o pai foi nomeado para a Embaixada da Grã-Bretanha, Jack deu início a uma série de viagens pela Europa nos anos 30. As tensões políticas e as mudanças de poder fascinavam este jovem americano. Ele viria a assistir a alguns dos eventos mais históricos do século XX, ao vivo. Estas visitas viriam a formar o seu futuro de formas que nunca imaginaria. A primeira viagem à Europa que Jack Kennedy fez foi em 1937. Ele e um colega de escola, Lem Billings, zarparam dos Estados Unidos levando o carro desportivo de Jack e passaram 10 semanas a percorrer a Europa. No ano seguinte, em 1938, Joe Kennedy Sr. foi nomeado embaixador dos Estados Unidos no Reino Unido pelo Presidente Roosevelt. Jack voltou a viajar até à Europa, mas desta vez não foi explicitamente em lazer. Viajou para a Inglaterra para trabalhar na embaixada, onde sentiria pela primeira vez um cheirinho da política por dentro.
This showed him the international scene of global high politics and what could follow from them. It was an extraordinary kind of education, because his father, you see, had not only a front row seat, but his father had a unique position in relation to the government of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. So we're not just talking about any ambassador's son. Joe Kennedy was at the vortex of European events in the late 1930s, and he was a major actor on that scene.
It was while Jack was there that he became fascinated by the rearmament that was going on in England and the growing rise of fascism on the continent.
This gave him extraordinary insight into the nature of Hitler, of Hitlerism, the nature of charisma. It was an extraordinary kind of tutelage, if you like, into the power of propaganda, because he saw, unlike historians, that this whole regime was about propaganda. The whole thing was driven by the most brilliant levels of propaganda history had ever seen.
No ano seguinte, viajaria para a Europa pela terceira vez. Desta vez, porém, não ficou em Londres. Viajou para o Médio Oriente, para a União Soviética e para os Balcãs, para pesquisar para a tese do último ano. Depois foi à Checoslováquia e à Alemanha. O que viu foi a Europa à beira da guerra. Deixou Berlim a 1 de setembro de 1939, o dia em que a Alemanha invadiu a Polónia.
I think this trip had a lasting influence on him in the sense that he was someone who truly believed in being there.
He was very interested in political history. That's what he wanted to study, and he wanted to see it firsthand.
He realized that Europe was on the verge of meltdown. He wanted to educate himself onto the global scene, and this was the best and most practical way of doing it.
Kennedy has a faith in his own judgment and his own perception, and being there on the ground, traveling around, becomes a motif of his political career.
Here was an opportunity where he could actually visit these countries simply with his passport and a letter from his father as the United States ambassador to Britain.
Jack voltou para casa e começou a escrever a sua tese. Graças ao pai, seria um trabalho que estaria para lá dos estudos em Harvard.
The idea was to see how slow Britain had been to recognize the threat of Germany. His professors were very laudatory, really, because, after all, it was unusual for a student to be able to have such first-hand information. It was shown to a friend of Jack's father who worked at the New York Times, Arthur Crock, and he said, you know, this is an awfully good dissertation. This would make a book.
In the summer of 1940, John Kennedy's first book, Why England Slept, is published. By the spring of 41, it sold something like 80,000 copies in America and Britain, although there is the rumour that his father bought up 30,000 copies and stored them at his home in Hyannisport.
For the United States, which was still a neutral country, but looking at what was happening in Europe, this seemed almost like a wake-up call.
It establishes a key component of his image, which is that he is a man of letters. This is someone who is an authentic intellectual who publishes books. It's also important because it furnishes the cornerstone of his foreign policy ideology. You want to understand what John Kennedy is saying about foreign policy during the Cold War. If you want to understand his foreign policy during his presidency, you can still learn a lot about it by reading Why England Slept.
Para Jack, o livro pareceu ser o ponto de viragem na sua vida. Até agora, vivera na sombra do irmão mais velho e mais competente. O ataque a Pearl Harbor fez da guerra uma preocupação global. E como muitas famílias, os Kennedy não estavam imunes aos seus efeitos. A vida política de Joe Sr. viria a ser a primeira baixa.
As ambassador, he began to see himself more and more as the peacemaker of Europe, that he could do a deal. He could get the British Prime Minister and the Führer together around a table, and that somehow he would be able to make it all come right. When it turned out that he had misunderstood Hitler, when it was obvious that Britain was standing alone, Joseph Kennedy lost faith in Britain.
He had very much the businessman's fix-it mentality. He really didn't understand all this blood and soil mystical stuff. He thought you could do deals. He thought you could pay them.
That becomes a deeply controversial position and unpopular with the British people. And he becomes an embarrassment. It's why often in JFK's later campaigns, although Joseph Kennedy is pulling the strings behind the scenes, he's often not out there in public. So by 1941, his political career is over.
The President of the United States wasn't even using his ambassador to London because he didn't think Joseph Kennedy was right. And he didn't think the Prime Minister of Britain, Neville Chamberlain, was right. The President believed that Winston Churchill had the makings of the one person who could stand up to Hitler. And that left Joseph Kennedy out in the cold.
Apesar da sua saúde frágil, Jack estava desejoso de se alistar no exército norte-americano. Na posse de um atestado médico, conseguiu ingressar na Marinha pouco antes do ataque a Pearl Harbor. Jack estava sedento de ação, mas a sua saúde mantinha-o numa secretária em Washington, a trabalhar nos serviços secretos da Marinha. Foi durante esse período que conheceu o primeiro e talvez o maior amor da sua vida, Inga Harvard.
He met this beautiful Danish woman who was 7 years older than him, Inga Harvard.
It's one of the few times in his life where he's very emotionally involved. I think it's partly physical attraction. She's very beautiful and she's worldly.
She was a journalist in Washington, and pretty much everybody she interviewed fell in love with her, including Jack Kennedy. But she was drawn to him. He'd been to Europe, so he had a feeling for her as a European. He was fascinated by politics, and the fact that she had interviewed Hitler and Goering before she left Europe, that made her very special in his eyes.
The trouble is that Adolf Hitler adored her. The Führer had said that she was the ideal Aryan woman. She was really seen in Washington as a kind of Mata Hari, and she was feared.
As ligações dela a Hitler e à elite nazi significavam que o FBI estava de olho nela. Conversas privadas e os contactos entre ela e Jack eram registados. Parecia que ninguém aprovava a relação.
His family, she's not exactly wife material in their view. She's not Catholic, she's twice divorced. But also his superiors in naval intelligence are concerned about this young naval intelligence officer caught up in a passionate relationship with this, beautiful woman who we're not sure if she maybe is a spy.
He was crazily in love with this woman, told his father he was going to marry her. The father said, no, you can't. And finally, the father spoke to Inga and said, listen, you are never going to marry my son. Get that out of your mind. This cannot be. You will get locked up. So back off. That put an end to the relationship. He admitted to somebody I interviewed that she was the love of his life. But it was not to be.
Embora o pai não concordasse que ele realizasse combates navais, Joe Sr. acabou por facilitar o desejo do filho. Jack tornou-se piloto de um torpedeiro de patrulha. Estes barcos eram pequenos e estavam prontos para o combate. Não é claro se foram os remorsos por ter posto fim ao caso com Inga que levaram Joe Sr. a mudar de ideias, mas certificou-se de que o barco de Jack se encontrava fora de águas hostis. Ainda assim, uma demonstração inesperada de violência por parte dos japoneses em redor das Ilhas Salomão fez com que Jack acabasse por enfrentar um ataque. A guerra teria consequências agridoces para a família Kennedy. Apesar da tragédia ter ocorrido na Europa, as honrarias não faltariam nos Estados Unidos. Na noite de 1 de agosto de 1943, durante uma patrulha de rotina com outros 2 torpedeiros, Jack detectou um navio inimigo. Antes de poder reagir e atacar, o seu barco foi abalroado e partido ao meio pelo contra-torpedeiro japonês.
It's in the middle of the night. They don't have proper radar. They don't have good physical sighting at that point. And ultimately, his boat is actually stove in two. Some of his crew members are killed instantly, but some of them survive and they're in the waters. And Jack Kennedy is able to rescue some of them.
He performs heroically. Using a belt in his mouth, he tows a crew member 3.5 miles to an island.
This is a man who has extensive health problems, has extreme back problems. He swims for 5 hours to get those men to safety.
9 of the men survived. They managed to swim to this literally desert island to stay there until Jack Kennedy arranged through a local native to get out a coconut with a message saying they were still alive, and they were finally rescued.
His older brother has always been better than him at school. There was a competitive dynamic between these two brothers, and Joe Jr. maybe feels that he needs to prove himself even more. He's already gone above and beyond. And then maybe because of the heroics of his younger brother, maybe out of his own sense of duty and service, he actually volunteers for a very dangerous mission to bomb a German airbase in Belgium.
No one is ever compelled to go on a mission where the probability is that he will lose his life. Essentially, he became an American kamikaze. They were wiring up bombers, filling them with explosives to attack the V-rocket emplacements in occupied Europe.
A missão falhou e as bombas explodiram a bordo do avião antes de alcançar o objetivo. Joe Kennedy Jr. ainda estava a bordo e morreu instantaneamente. Para toda a família Kennedy, foi uma perda trágica. Enquanto Jack ainda tentava superar a morte do irmão, começou a espalhar-se a notícia dos seus atos heróicos no Pacífico.
There's a writer for Life magazine called John Hersey, and he approaches Kennedy and says, I'd like to write an article on what you've done for the New Yorker magazine. Now, Joseph Kennedy, working behind the scenes, gets it republished with Reader's Digest. So a large number of people in 1944 read this vivid account of John Kennedy's bravery in World War II. So 1940, with Why England Slept, the idea of him as an intellectual, a man of letters, of cultural sophistication, that idea is established. With the service in World War II, a second element in his image is established, which is that he's a war hero. So what you have is the idea that he has brains and brawn.
People have speculated that it was just the death of the older brother that pushed JFK into politics. That is nonsense. The fact is, from the FBI records, JFK was talking about going into politics and even going as far as the presidency way back at the time of Pearl Harbor in his conversations with Inga Arvad. To the extent that the brother might have been in the way, but the fact that he had been killed opened the way for JFK to accept the family mantle, if you like, and the father was willing to fund it.
Após o incidente com o torpedeiro, John ficou com problemas crónicos de coluna e passou à reserva. O irmão tinha morrido e a carreira do pai tinha chegado ao fim. Jack arranjou emprego como jornalista, mas mantinha-se a dúvida sobre o que devia fazer a seguir. Decidiram então que Jack concorreria ao Congresso em 1946. Mais uma vez, Joe Sr. seria vital para que isso acontecesse.
He will run for Congress, and his father helps make that happen by inducing local Democratic congressmen to vacate his seat and run for mayor of Boston instead. It's not a shoo-in for Jack Kennedy, though. He doesn't necessarily have strong ties in the community. So they have to start really building connections in Boston.
Behind the scenes, Joseph Sr. is spending huge amounts of money. A typical amount of money for a congressional candidate in 1946 would have been something like $25,000. Estimates are that Joe Kennedy spent at least 10 times that amount, at least $250,000, maybe $500,000.
What JFK understood was the imagery of politics would transform the business. His father was an expert in that field, so between the two of them were able to change the course of American politicking and campaigning.
Joseph Kennedy hired 2 advertising agencies to promote Kennedy's campaign. So these advertising agencies would contact the media, they would polish his speeches. He even hired a billboard specialist who put up 90 billboards around the city, Boston. And so it's an incredibly slick campaign.
The fact that he was facing such ill health did make him aware that he could project an image that could cover that up. He had a certain shyness, a certain modesty, which allowed him on camera to come across as youthful, handsome, thoughtful, compassionate, and all those things were genuine.
A campanha resultou. E em novembro de 1946, John F. Kennedy conquistou o lugar do 11º distrito do Massachusetts. Contudo, cedo percebeu que a vida de um congressista talvez não fosse bem o que esperava.
Now, the truth was, as a congressman, he wasn't impressive. He was quite lazy, he used to party a lot, he was also ill a lot, and he often wasn't there. But he didn't have an outstanding reputation when he's in the House of Representatives.
Actually, he found it very boring to pursue the interests of working-class Bostonians, to defend their rights was an honorable activity. But ultimately, it was the world stage which interests him. It was the great questions of war and peace. It was the macro struggle between communism and democracy, because he saw things on a global template, not just the little workings of the internal parish.
Jack esteve 6 anos no cargo de congressista, antes de ter em vista o Senado.
His intent, I think, always was to go for a Senate seat, but of course he was very young. In a state like Massachusetts, it was going to be a huge battle, and many people said, don't try.
They decide that this is the time to run for the US Senate, and he'll be running against Henry Cabot Lodge.
That campaign was run in a kind of modern, slick way. And what's also important to note is that in the campaign against Lodge, Kennedy's views on foreign policy on the Cold War were probably more hardline than lodgers. And probably a good many people, including some Republicans, voted for Kennedy in '52 because they thought he would be more hardline on the Cold War than Henry Cabot Lodge.
The family recognized that they had a star and that actually people would like to meet the star and shake hands. It was very effective.
Like the '46 campaign, the 1952 campaign for the Senate highlighted Kennedy's appeal as a sex symbol, and there's a lot of talk of his physical attractiveness, and also his appeal as a symbol of the family. The 1952 Senate campaign is most famous for the teas held by his mother and his sisters for women. I think it's estimated something like 70,000 women attended those teas, which coincidentally was his winning margin. He defeated Lodge by 70,000 votes. And this might seem an extravagant statement, but I think it's entirely defensible that more than any other politician in American history, Kennedy symbolized family life because he's seen as a representative of a dynasty.
A imagem de John F. Kennedy foi algo que tinha trabalhado e aperfeiçoado. Ele era o intelectual, o herói de guerra, o homem de família, e graças aos lanches, as mulheres mais velhas queriam cuidar dele e as mais novas queriam casar-se com ele. Todavia, antes de ser eleito para o Senado, a sua fama de playboy começou a tornar-se problemática. O pai concordava que o que fazia falta a Jack era uma esposa.
When John F. Kennedy runs for the US Senate, he's a bachelor. He's obviously had a lot of relationships with women over the years, but he's never gotten married, and he enters the US Senate in 1953 as a single man. There's an article in the Saturday Evening Post headlined, "The Senate's Gay Young Bachelor." And, you know, there's a lot made of his marital status. Now, at that time, he'd actually already met Jackie Bouvier. They'd been introduced at a dinner party in Georgetown by a mutual friend.
There was certainly a strong element of mutual attraction. There's an article in Life magazine in the summer of 1953 with the headline, "Senator Kennedy Goes A-Courting," and a picture of him and Jackie Kennedy on a sailboat. And it's a very glamorous image. So it's a private matter, but it also affects JFK's image.
Jackie Kennedy had unique gifts. She was a remarkable woman, highly intelligent, highly insightful, a very, very good foil to him. Similarly, they'd both come from very troubled backgrounds. Her father had been a chronic alcoholic, her parents divorced when she was 12. So there was a kind of mutual sympathy, a mutual understanding.
It's unclear if Jack really wanted to get married, if he really saw himself as a marrying man. Certainly, he appreciated freedom in his romantic life. But it's his father that basically, with a little bit of political calculation, says being the Senate's gay young bachelor isn't going to cut it for very long. And if you want to be president, you have to have a family, and you have to have a wife, and the political image is important. And Jackie Bouvier fits all of those criteria for being a political wife, and a political wife to a prominent Catholic politician.
He had always built up the family as a brand. Remember, in those days, most men were married at 22. To be unmarried at 35 raised certain questions. Were you a serial philanderer? In this case, true. So it kind of, if you like, embourgeoisified the Kennedy label. They were anything but bourgeois. They were very wealthy bohemians. But this turned it into something much more palatable, much more acceptable. You can't have a king without a queen. You can't have a prince without a princess. And here she came.
Jack e Jackie casaram-se a 12 de setembro de 1953 na igreja St. Mary's, Newport, Rhode Island. O jovem senador já não era solteirão. O casamento foi conturbado desde o início, com ambos a terem casos extramatrimoniais. Mas aquilo para que ambos trabalhavam e compreendiam era a imagem. O importante era projetar a ideia de um casal feliz.
She was pretty perfect in terms of the senator's wife and the prospective presidential nominee's wife. But as to their actual relationship, I think the honest truth from all the people who were very close to them was that this was not a love relationship.
One of the interesting things about that relationship is that she was aware of his womanizing.
It was common knowledge within his close circle and increasingly known more widely. What really happened is that people turned a blind eye to it. They didn't want to know.
In terms of the marital drama, it was always on a knife edge, and there is no doubt that Jackie was on the point of divorcing.
There's stories that she even approached Joe Kennedy and said that she was contemplating a divorce, and it's Joe that patches that over and says, you know, do what you need to do, spend what you need to do to some extent to make you happy and to stay in this marriage, because the symbolism and the qualities that Jackie Kennedy brought to her public life were so valuable, and he saw that value, and he knows that without her, Jack's political career is ruined.
Prior to his marriage, his sexual appeal was seen as an exciting attribute of his bachelorhood. After his marriage, it's seen as an attribute of this marriage to this glamorous, beautiful woman. There are a lot of magazines in the mid and late 50s that have them on the cover long before he reaches the White House. So she adds to his sexual appeal.
A marca Kennedy estava criada e foi a Convenção Democrata de 1956 que a projetou a nível nacional.
I give you the next Democratic nominee and our next President of the United States, Adlai E. Stevenson.
O discurso televisionado de Jack trouxe-lhe tantos apoiantes que ele quase deu por si como candidato a vice-presidente de Adlai E. Stevenson. Se ele tivesse ganhado, as suas futuras aspirações à presidência teriam quase de certeza ido por água abaixo. Os democratas sofreram uma pesada derrota nas eleições de 1956 e Kennedy continuaria a lutar no Senado. Ainda assim, a convenção veio provar uma coisa: John F. Kennedy causava boa impressão. Quem ele era, a sua imagem, tudo apelava a um público que consumia avidamente tudo o que lhe era fornecido através da televisão. A 2 de janeiro de 1960, Jack deu início à sua campanha para a nomeação pelos democratas. Em novembro desse ano, iria enfrentar o vice-presidente Richard Nixon na corrida à Casa Branca, no que viria a tornar-se uma das eleições mais renhidas de sempre. No entanto, a religião de Kennedy revelava-se ainda um possível problema para o eleitorado americano.
In a way, the biggest issue that Kennedy has to deal with in 1960 is the religious issue of his own Catholic faith. No Catholic had ever been elected president. What some Americans felt was that a Catholic president might owe their allegiance to Rome, to the Pope, to the Catholic faith, rather than to the United States and the American Constitution. So this is a major issue that Kennedy has to deal with, and I think initially he'd rather not talk about it. By the time they get to the West Virginia primary, in the spring of 1960, he decides to tackle it head on.
He gives a speech before the Ministerial Association of Greater Houston. So this is an organization of Protestant ministers. And he gives a speech to say, I'm not a Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic candidate for president who happens to be Catholic. So he essentially challenges this long-standing concern that Catholics have dual loyalties in the political sphere, and it's a watershed moment in terms of religious discussions in American political campaigns.
It adds another element to this multifaceted image that he'd been developing, and that is the idea of Kennedy as a man of faith. The whole debate over Kennedy's religion in 1960 is based on the idea that his Catholic faith was important to him.
Ainda assim, ninguém na campanha de Kennedy tinha a certeza de que as suas garantias chegavam para derrotar Nixon. O momento decisivo chegaria no final de 1960, com uma série de debates televisivos entre os dois candidatos.
They have a televised presidential debate, and John F. Kennedy, behind the scenes, is not the healthiest of men at this point, projects health and vigor and vitality.
The candidates need no introduction. The Republican candidate, Vice President Richard M. Nixon, and the Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy.
He's tanned, he's wearing makeup, his father's work in Hollywood means that he knows the best television men, and so they've all done everything they can to present him perfectly for the television age. And Nixon, he's not been very well, he's had a bit of a temperature. He looks sort of older and crumpled, even though they're similar ages. So, you know, just the images that are projected are so different, and that association of Kennedy with youth, modernity, and the future stays with him, and Nixon can never really identify with that.
Because they felt that the American society was moving again, I want us to recapture that image.
That first television debate showed the importance of image. The overwhelming majority of people who watched that debate on their television sets thought that Kennedy had won comprehensively. People who listened on radio thought that it had been a tie, which says everything about the importance of the visual image. Before that first debate, Kennedy was behind in the polls, narrowly, but he was behind in the polls. After the first television debate with Nixon, Kennedy moved ahead in the polls, and he stayed ahead.
Desfiles e comemorações rejubilantes marcaram o dia em que JFK ganhou as eleições à Casa Branca. Mas para o homem que aclamavam, isto assinalava o princípio do fim. Para muitos, ele era o líder perfeito para uma América moderna. Mas as suas medidas e o seu dogma político baseavam-se em experiências passadas. As suas manobras políticas e a atitude independente pareciam astutas para um homem tão jovem, mas por trás dele estava um pai a puxar os cordelinhos e a tomar decisões. Contudo, o que fez sobressair este colegial adoentado de Nova Inglaterra foi a sua imagem. Era tudo para todos e tornou-se o molde para um novo tipo de político. Todos estes fatores foram cuidadosamente misturados para se fazer um presidente verdadeiramente moderno.